be on data collection. So we're first going to talk about taking data for behavior data. Every single one of your clients should have a list of target behaviors, and each one of those behaviors will have an operational definition. So when you're taking behavior data, you want to make sure that you're only taking behavior data for behaviors that are listed in the operational definition. This is important because you want to make sure that you're ensuring accuracy and consistency across the team. So here's an example of an operational definition for self-injurious behavior. This one states, episodes are defined as hitting or attempting to hit own head with closed fist or open palm with force and or hitting head against the table or wall, which may or may not be paired with grunting, groaning, yelling, negative self-talk, and or noncompliance. If self-injurious behavior is paired with other target maladaptive behaviors, track them separately. Episodes are separated by 30 seconds or more of non-occurrence. So what do you do if the child engages in other self-injurious behaviors that are not listed in the operational definition? This is actually very common, where initially when the supervisor wrote the problem behavior in the operational definition, these may have been the only types of behaviors that occurred, but over time new behaviors may occur. So for example, for this specific child, let's say you're doing therapy with him and all of a sudden he bites himself. Because it's not listed in the definition here, you would not track biting as self-injurious behavior. When this happens, you want to make sure you first of all contact your supervisor via email, call, phone, whatever they want, and you want to let them know, like, hey, by the way, during my session, I noticed that this child was biting. The supervisor might ask you to take ABC data on the behavior just to make sure that it has the same function as all the other behaviors in self-injurious behavior. They may decide to include biting in this definition, or they might decide to have biting as a completely separate behavior to track. So it's very important to contact your supervisor, let them know, do not start tracking new behaviors if they are not listed in here. And all of these operational definitions will be in the FBA or the behavior intervention plan that the supervisor has in your logbook. Now we're going to look at tracking behavior data. So we will most likely be taking rate data for most cases. If all of your client sessions are the same duration, your supervisor actually may ask you to take frequency data. So if your clients all have 2-hour sessions, frequency data is appropriate. However, if some of your sessions are 2 hours and another session is 2.5 hours and so on, it's not appropriate to take frequency data, and in this case you would take rate data. So in order to do so, you would tally the number of times the child engages in the problem behavior, and that's the frequency, which means count. Then you want to divide it by the total number of hours in your session. So if you have a 2-hour session, you want to divide this frequency, divide it by 2. If you have a 1.5-hour session, you want to divide the frequency by 1.5, and that's how you would get your rate. When looking at behaviors and looking at your report, the operational definition may be written in 2 different ways. One way that it might be written is this example right here, number 1. So for example, this one says, for tantrums, episodes are defined as yelling or screaming for longer than 10 seconds, which may or may not be paired with crying with or without tears, throwing self on the floor, and or swiping or attempting to swipe objects. Episodes are separated by 30 seconds or more of non-occurrence. This same definition can also be written this way, number 2. Tantrums are yelling or screaming, which may or may not be paired with crying, with or without tears, throwing self on the floor, and or swiping or attempting to swipe objects. Now, the onset of the behavior may be listed separately. So it says onset, when any of the above behaviors have been engaged in for at least 10 seconds. And then the offset is when any of the above behaviors have not been engaged in for at least 30 seconds. So let's say your child starts throwing a tantrum. He starts yelling and screaming. Okay, you set the timer. It goes longer than 10 seconds. So now you know you're going to start tracking that behavior as a tantrum. If the crying, yelling, screaming lasted for, let's say, 5 seconds, this would not count as a tantrum according to this definition. So the onset tells you when to start tracking the behavior. So let's say the child is, crying and they stop crying. And they stop crying for at least 30 seconds, and then they start crying again, you would tally another episode. But if the child is crying and they stop crying for less than 30 seconds, so like let's say 10 seconds, and then they start crying again, this is all that same episode. So in your data, you would actually have one tally if that break with no tantrum was less than 30 seconds. It should be also good to note that the onset offset time is different according to your case. So make sure you read your FBA or read your behavior intervention plan to know when the offset time and the onset time and the offset time is for your particular client, because it will be case by case. So during this presentation, you're going to see a lot of abbreviations, and these are some abbreviations that are commonly used. MT is mass trial, and we'll go over all of these in a bit. RR is random rotation. EL is errorless learning. And EC is error correction. And P is prompt. So the first one that we're going to talk about is mass trial. Mass trial is typically used in DTT, or otherwise known as discrete trial teaching. The definition of mass trial is repeated consecutive trials of the same SD instruction and target. So let's say you're teaching body parts and you're introducing tummy. You're teaching the child to receptively identify his tummy. So the first trial, you would say, touch tummy. Child touches his tummy. You're like, good. And then you would present tummy again in the second trial, and then in the third trial, and so on and so forth. You would not present any other body part during this time. Now, in random rotation, this is when you present 2 or more SD or targets in random order. So in the previous example, let's say you're working on tummy, and the child starts getting really high scores when you're presenting tummy over and over and over. The child may have gotten a high score in mass trial, but you want to test to see if he or she will continue to respond appropriately when tummy is thrown in the mix with other body parts. So now in this example, you say touch tummy, the child touches their tummy. But if you say touch head, can the child now touch his head? And then if you say, like, let's say touch feet, can the child touch his feet? So now you're teaching the child to learn to discriminate and to listen to your SDs. Okay. The next thing we're going to be talking about is errorless learning. So the definition of errorless learning is teaching procedures that are specifically designed so the learner does not have to and does not make mistakes as they learn new information. The prompt should then be slowly faded as a child demonstrates success. So I want you to think about when you're learning a foreign language. If I asked you how to say a word in Chinese, and let's say you don't know how to speak Chinese, you would probably need a prompt right away. Because obviously, if I said, what is, word in Chinese, you wouldn't know the answer. So I would need to tell you right away. Or when you're learning a new phone number, you would need to hear it first. I can't expect you to know it. So that's why it's important to teach Airless Learning for new targets, and to fade your prompt as quickly as possible. So you never want to keep your targets in Airless Learning, or your child will become very dependent on your prompts. So for example, in this example, we're teaching the child how to follow the instruction clap in Airless Learning. So the child has never learned this instruction before. If you told him to clap, he would not know what to do. So you tell him, clap, but you prompt right away because he doesn't know what to do. So you might hold both of their hands and clap for them. And you might say, good, that's clapping. Then you present the second trial, clap. Of course, this is a second trial. Child still might not get the hang of it, so you might prompt again. So let's say you provide a full physical prompt 3 times and you kind of think the child is getting a hang of it. So you say clap, and then you might maybe like tap their elbows, or hold their wrists up, but then you let go and the child finishes up by clapping. So that would be counted as a partial physical prompt. Let's say you presented that prompt again in the next trial, but the next time you said clap, he does it independently. So he got a correct response. It should be noted that Errorless Learning data should only have prompts or correct responses. If the child starts to engage in an incorrect response, like for example, he got a correct in trial 6 and a correct in trial 7, but he did not get a correct in trial 8, you would prompt right away. Okay, you wouldn't tell them no, you wouldn't tell them try again. When the target is in Errorless Learning, it's always prompted or correct. So in this example, he was prompted, he didn't get it with the partial physical. So then the therapist went in and did a full physical, and he eventually did it independently. Okay. So here's an example of Errorless Learning. So in this example, the therapist is teaching the child to respond to the instruction knock for the very first time. So the therapist in the first trial says knock, and immediately prompts the child to make a fist and physically knock on the door. The therapist marks it as a prompt in their data. They might say, good, that's knocking. Then they present the second trial. They say the same SD again. They say knock. Then they provide a partial physical prompt. So let's say they just prompted the child to close their fist, but then the child knocked on the door after that prompt. Then the therapist would say, good, that's knocking. This trial would still be considered a prompt even though the child eventually knocked on the door, because they needed that initial physical prompt to make a fist. So if at any time the therapist needed to provide any kind of prompt, and even though the child responded correctly after that prompt, this trial would be counted as a prompt, not a correct. So you want to make sure that the child is able to respond correctly independently. So then you present the trial again. The therapist says knock, but now they don't prompt, they're giving the child an opportunity to knock by themselves. And in this example, the child knocks by himself independently. Then the therapist gives them a lot of praise. The reason why this is in caps is because you want that praise to be a lot more than the prompted trials, right? So while in the prompted trials, you might say, good, that's knock. In the unprompted trials, you might be like, woohoo, and give them tickles and, spin them around or whatever. But this trial needs to be, the praise needs to be significant compared to the other trials where he was prompted. Okay. So it's important to understand the 3-term contingency when issuing SDs or instructions. So SD is the instruction that you're giving. So an SD would be like knock, or an SD would be come here, or SD would be give me. So it's the instruction. BX is the behavior. So it could be the child got the answer incorrect, the child got it correct, the child threw the stimuli, whatever the child did, that's the behavior. Then there's the response. So this is what the therapist does. So in step 1, the therapist issues an SD. So let's use a previous example. So the SD was knock. So the therapist says, knock. The child got it incorrect. So let's say he just kind of, he tapped on the table. You always need to follow up with a response. So in this response, the therapist says, try again. Afterwards, you want to present the SD again. You want to repeat that instruction. Knock. In this example, you give the child an opportunity to respond. Let's say they didn't, then you would need a prompt right away. But give them verbal feedback. Good. And then you would want to present the instruction again, knock. And when they get it correct, you want to respond with reinforcement, whether that be praise, whether that be a snack or time with video games or what have you. But every time the child responds, you need to follow up with some kind of response. You should not be repeating the SD or instruction over and over again until the child responds. Okay, so you don't want to say knock, child doesn't respond, and you say knock, knock, knock. Okay, every time the child responds in a behavior, or even if he doesn't respond, you want to give them a response, like a consequence. Okay, so like I said before, every time you say the SD or instruction, there needs to be a consequence, like no, or try again, prompt, or praise. If you prompt a trial, your data should only reflect with a P. You don't want to write XP for one trial or even XP with a P on the bottom. It's just a P. Okay. So what about non-responses? This is case specific, and you need to check with your supervisors about how to take data for non-responses. However, it is a therapist's responsibility to ensure that the child is fully attending when you're presenting the instruction. So when you're telling the child, come here, but the child is busy playing with this toy, or he's watching TV, he's not looking at you, then, this isn't the child's fault. It's the therapist's responsibility to make sure that they have the child's attention before even saying, come here. So you want to make sure you have the child's eye contact, make sure that their body is facing the therapist, because we have a lot of kids who might wiggle, or they might try to elope, or they might turn their body away from you. So you want to make sure you correct all of that. Look at me, body towards me. Want to make sure they're not distracted by objects or environment. So are they fidgeting with toys? Are they looking at lights, in front of them? Do you need to adjust their environment? So do you need them to turn away from the window so they're not distracted by the lights? Are they engaging in problem behaviors? Are they in the middle of aggression when you're telling the child to knock? So if the child is engaging in any of these behaviors, this is not the time to present the SD. You want to make sure that you take care of all of these things and make sure that you have the child's full attention before you even present an instruction. Number 2, you want to make sure that the child is still motivated. So sometimes, even though the child says, I want to work for goldfish crackers, when you're presenting trial after trial after trial, the child might forget what they're working for. They might start losing interest. They might start, their attention might start dropping. So in this time, you want to stop what you're doing. You don't want to keep presenting your instructions. and you want to remind the child of what they're working towards, like, remember, did you want goldfish? And make sure the child is motivated again. If the child is not motivated, you need to conduct another preference assessment before you even continue on with that goal. So, okay, so we're going to stop the goal. Okay, if you don't want goldfish, let's think about what else you want. Do you want to play video games? Do you want to go take a walk outside? And once a child picks a reinforcer, then you can continue on with the goal. Number 3, you want to make sure that you're presenting the SD or instruction clearly. This is a very common mistake, especially for kids who don't tune into words very clearly in your instruction. So for example, let's say you're teaching the child how to respond to an instruction in the goal function. So you're teaching the child to identify the object that you function with. So for example, if the SD was, what do you drive with? If you're saying to the child who really, isn't really attending to you, and if you're saying, what do you drive with? You don't want to count it against the child. So you might want to present the SD clearly. So you might say, what do you drive with? So do not present the SD until you've done this. And don't count this as a non-response. Don't count it as an incorrect. If you did not have the child's attention, if you did not present the SD clearly, or if the child was not motivated. You want to make sure you do all of these things before you present the instruction. Again, this is case specific, but these are things that should be done for all children. Okay, now we're going to look at error correction. This comes after errorless learning. So once the child gets over an 80% in errorless learning, you're going to move the target into error correction. So the definition of error correction is teaching procedure that presents an opportunity for the child to respond. So remember in errorless learning, when the child started to respond incorrectly, we prompted them right away. We didn't tell them no, we didn't tell them try again, we just prompted. So remember how all the data was P or O, or P or correct. So in error correction, your correct responses are differentially reinforced. And when the child makes an error, you tell them that they made an error. The therapist then follows up with prompts until the child correctly responds. So in this example, you're teaching the child to follow the instruction clap, and you're teaching them to follow the instruction arms up. That's what this is. C is clap and AU is arms up. So we're teaching the child to discriminate between these two instructions. So in trial 1, you said clap, you got it correct. Yay, awesome. Trial 2, you said arms up, you got it correct. Good. Now trial 3, you said clap, and let's say he'd put his arms up. Instead of prompting, in error correction, you would tell that child no, or you would tell them try again or almost, so you'd mark it with an X. The next trial, you need to follow up with a prompt right away. So you would say clap and provide a prompt. Okay, so you would continue to keep providing those prompts until the child gets a correct. Then in trial 7, presented the instruction clap, child got it correct, and then continue to rotate between arms up and clap, and the child got it correct. So let's see, in this example, let's look out for the 3-term contingency. The SD was, what's your address? The behavior was, child says, 123 street. You got it incorrect. So the response or consequences, therapist says, try again. And the next trial, the therapist presents the SD again. What's your address? But prompts right away. 123 Circle Street. The behavior is the child says 123 Circle Street. Therapist says, nice. In trial 3, you want to make sure that the child can do this by himself. So you present the trial again. what's your address? Then the child says 123 Circle Street. Then you respond, because the child got it correct all on his own. You say awesome, or some other kind of phrase. Here are some types of prompts that you might see in the field. FP is full physical prompt. PP is partial physical prompt. GP is gesture prompt. MP is model prompt. ProxP is proximity prompt. VisP is visual prompt. Text is textual prompt. FV is full verbal prompt. PV is partial verbal prompt. Voice inflection prompt. And there's IDV-LQ, which is indirect verbal leading questions. And these prompts are used more in the higher level programs. Let's see. If you have questions on the different types of prompts, you can go ahead and ask your supervisor, or you can contact me. Let's see. Okay. Now we're going to look at prompting when you're in error correction. So when you're in error correction, you're going to be using the least to most prompting strategy. Some of your supervisors might ask you to do no prompt strategy. You can ask them how to do it if that's what they prefer, but we're going to go over the least to most prompting strategy in this training. So it would be good to note that when you're prompting, you're not just presenting any kind of prompt. Okay, so let's say the child gives an incorrect response in error correction. So right here in this example, he got the third trial incorrect. The trial that comes after that, you're going to be providing the least intrusive prompt. When you look at the prompt hierarchy in this previous slide, and if you look at full physical prompt, partial physical prompt, gesture prompt, model prompt, a model prompt is less intrusive than a full physical prompt. A full physical prompt will most likely guarantee the correct response, while the model prompt may not, but that's least intrusive. So when you're in error correction, you want to make sure that the next trial after an incorrect is a least intrusive prompt. So let's say that you present the SD again, and the child gets an incorrect on the next trial. You don't continue to provide that least intrusive prompt because it's not working. So you want to go in and provide the most intrusive prompt that guarantees the correct response. Okay, let's say even still this doesn't work. You would stick to this most intrusive prompt until the child gets a correct response. Okay, so you never want to see data that says PPPX, PXO. This would continue to be P's until that child gets a correct response. Okay, now we're going to be looking at the mastery criteria. So again, this is case specific. This is just going to be like the general guideline for discrete child teaching. However, it would be very important to note whenever you start a new case, you ask your supervisor what your client's mastery criteria is. So how do you know that a certain target is considered mastered? You don't want to keep a target going for a long time. You want to keep moving things along. And in order to do so, you need to know what the mastery criteria is. So this general mastery criteria, in the first step, you would mass trial the target in Airless Learning one time at 80% or higher with the first trial correct. What that means is, let's say you're teaching the child to respond to receptively identify tummy for body parts. So you're saying, what is it? Tummy. What is it? Tummy. So you're still doing tummy in Airless Learning. Remember, no incorrects. If in your data you get 80% or higher, but that first trial is correct, in your next session, you would go in and start error correction. You wouldn't continue with Airless Learning because the child is past that point. If your first trial is not correct, let's say the first trial was a P, but the rest of your trials was a correct, so the child ended up getting 90%, but had to be prompted the first trial, you would continue with Airless Learning in your next session. So in your next session, let's say you do mass trial, the target and error correction 1 time or higher. Again, if it's 80% or higher with the first trial correct, then you would randomly rotate this target versus all of the other master targets. Now you would do this 2 times at 80% or higher with the first trial correct. Again, this is case specific, so make sure you talk to your supervisor. Okay, so let's go over calculating the percentage. When you're calculating the percentage, you want to get the total number of correct responses and divide it by the total number of trials. So in this example, you have 7 correct responses, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And then you want to divide it by the total number of trials, so including the 7, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So you would do 7 divided by 10, which is 70%. So this concludes the end of the data collection training. If you have further questions, you can always email training@proofpositive.com, or you can always ask one of your supervisors to go over the training in more detail. Thank you.